The next chapter is on narratives and the power of narratives, or what people follow, kind of like life philosophies maybe, but stories or whatever. On page 100, there's a nice thing. There's a nice piece here I want to read on Rousseau and then Nietzsche. So it says here that reason was offered in its place, and that place was religion. When religion was receding, reason was offered in its place. But as I have already discussed, Rousseau and his followers argued that while reason may be useful in producing scientific truths, it is the sketchiest of maps on which to base the quest for moral truth. Indeed, it is an impediment to that quest. So let me just pause for a second. As I was saying before, religion provided this. When I was talking before about the orthodoxy kind of hid a lot of problems. But once you remove the orthodoxy, then these things that were taken care of, I'm using as a phrase, they were taken care of, but not perfect and not often not great. But once you remove that narrative, then you get all these things coming out as problems. So once you remove a narrative of religious orthodoxy, if you like, then you now have a problem of, okay, what ought I do? If I don't have a purpose from religion, I need to find a purpose from somewhere else or make up my own purpose, right? So the question then has to be answered. It can be answered by a narrative, or if it's not being answered by a narrative, then it has to be answered some other way. And so once you remove this orthodoxy, you now have to provide answers for all these other questions that were answered by the narrative, right, previously. And so once this enlightenment has come about and the orthodoxy challenged and removed, largely removed today, you have to provide a moral framework for all these people who don't adopt one from tradition. And now I'll continue. So in the 19th century, Nietzsche put the matter in a brutal light by arguing that reason is a kind of linguistic illusion, that good and evil are equally illusory, and that there is nothing, and just pause for a second, good and evil, of course, was a narrative, right, of religion. And now I'll continue. Good and evil are equally illusory, and that there is nothing but one's will and the power to realize one's will. In other words, there is no difference between the sentences, I want to do this, and I have a right to do this. The second sentence is merely a disguise, an attempt to hide from oneself the naked expression of one's will. And you can compare this to where in the past you have all these God-fearing people running around and on this panopticon, to today where people think, selfish is, you could say selfish, but I tend to like the Ayn Rand version of selfish, which is not the same as what most people think it means. But you have sometimes what's called the selfie culture, where you're constantly considering your own often unnecessary proclivities and activities, and you're exercising Nietzsche's will. And I think you can connect this to entitlements, the entitlement kind of stuff happening right now. And rather, where in the past a lot of these questions were taken care of by a narrative like a religion, once they're removed, you have people who are almost like back to a state of nature where it's a zero-sum game, and any loss that they may take would be detrimental, and it would promote someone else. They would gain. And so that's why you have this Nietzschean view of, so your existence is dependent on your exercise of your will, and that is a competition with other people. That makes a competition, that your will is often, if you don't exercise your will, it may come at your expense because someone else will exercise their will. It seems, I guess the point is that these problems are coming about because of this loss of a narrative. And like I've been saying, the narratives are not perfect. And I don't agree, for the record, I'm not religious and I don't agree with the orthodoxy. I don't think that's a good way of living. But my point, and I think the point of Postman, is that these narratives took care of certain things. They hid away some of these problems. But once the narrative is broken down, once God is dead, as Nietzsche reported in Thus Spake Zarathustra, you have all these demons come out, and these demons have to be taken care of. We can't just we can't just focus on technology, which are better means, right? We have to focus on the use of these things, because we no longer have a narrative that we trust to provide the answers. We no longer have a narrative that's worked. And so we have to then re-engage with these questions of purpose that in the past were, quote, answered by a narrative, right? The Ten Commandments, or whatever you want to use. Something like, you can use religion as an example of a narrative, but also doesn't have to be religious. You can consider a secular one, like the U.S. Constitution. These are anything that you can put on a stone, like a code of laws. Hammurabi's Code of Laws, you may have heard of. These are approaches to social organization and to ethics. These kinds of things are what is needed, and if we cannot bind up humanity in several of these that conflict and provide conflict, then we need to create a kind of humanistic one or a secular one. And so Postman also points out on the next page that narratives are so powerful, and we know that because to attack a person's way of life or beliefs is really anathema. You really want to piss someone off, you attack their beliefs, because this is what gives them meaning. The most essential or the most valued part of a person is often where they get their direction in life from. And so, one quote on page 101, he says, that is the reason why there is nothing more disconcerting, to put it mildly, than to have one's story mocked, contradicted, refuted, held in contempt, or made to appear trivial. So, for example, if you were to be a candidate in the U.S. presidency, and you were to declare yourself an atheist, or you were to mock Christianity in some way, that would be it. Because these narratives, or consider the social justice warrior movement, if you are to mock feminism or etc., you will be that's the end of the rational argument. If you mock these things, if you mock the narratives, that these things that give people meaning, they will not talk with you. That'll be it. Narratives are powerful binding forces for people's lives. Here's a really good point, something I've actually starred in the book, so it's a very essential point. He says that the first and most obvious is to reaffirm the necessity of a transcendent narrative, for without one we can have no sense of purpose. Without a sense of purpose, we are left with only power as the source of authority. And Ayn Rand would call this Attila the Hun, the mystic of muscle, I think she called it. If you don't have a narrative, then you will follow the nearest tyrant, who will provide you with your needs at the expense of your freedom, right? And I'll paraphrase it, but what Postman goes on to say is that Nietzsche and Heidegger, they critiqued narratives. They disposed of narratives. Nietzsche, of course, with Christianity, but they left humanity with nothing. They merely, what Nietzsche called, they merely broke the table of values. That's from Thus Spake Zarathustra. Nietzsche did. He did say that a new table of values was needed, but he didn't provide any details. He just merely said that we have to break up this narrative, but what's up to you, what you make, what you create. And here's a really good example of a modern nihilistic, pessimistic narrative. And I believe this comes from Bertrand Russell, and I'll quote it at length here. He says, "Man is the product of causes which had no prevision of the end they were achieving. That his origins, his growth, his hopes and fears, his loves and his beliefs are but the outcome of accidental collocations of atoms. That no fire, no heroism, no intensity of thought and feeling can preserve an individual life beyond the grave. That all the labors of the ages, all the devotion, all the inspiration, all the noonday brightness of human genius are destined to extinction in the vast death of the solar system, and that the whole temple of man's achievement must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of a universe in ruins. All these things, if not quite beyond dispute, are yet so nearly certain that no philosophy which rejects them can hope to stand." And what Postman says is that, I suppose in some corner of our brain we can believe this story, but it is the sort of belief we can do nothing with, and which does nothing for us. So, and I think this is a really good point, because we have this idea of we're going to die at some point. All of us have a terminal existence, which is interesting because, and yet, most people seem to live as if they're going to live forever. Most people live day to day as if they will live forever, which is interesting. So most people just kind of ignore it. But everyone knows they're going to die. So if that is, well, it is the case. But given that fact, why live? Why do anything if necessarily it will all eventually be finished at some point? And nothing will matter because you are no longer there to value anything. The nihilistic view uses modern science and reminds us that our fates are sealed. And of course, what ignores what religion says, that there's some afterlife, because there's no evidence for it. Which I think is a proper assumption to make, that there is no afterlife, and so live as if there isn't, and if there is, then it's a bonus. But you should live as if there isn't. You should take that assumption. But the point is that this yet true narrative is not something that you can live by, which is a weird thing, because the fact of this temporary existence is not something that we can live by. It doesn't give us any hopes or meaning in this life, although some people might say that because we have a limited existence, that actually gives us meaning. Because can you imagine a life where you are going to exist forever? Someone might posit this and say, if you knew that you had an infinite number of days, why would you get up and play that game, or get up and read that book, or get up and you couldn't die, you didn't have to eat or drink or anything like that. Your existence was infinite, and it was not conditional. Your existence was not conditional on anything. Why would you get up out of bed? Well, I guess you wouldn't even be sleeping. You wouldn't need to. Why would you do anything in a life of forever? Because you could just do that thing tomorrow. Whatever you were thinking of doing, you could just do it tomorrow, right? Like, you get into this weird situation in which a life of forever is a life actually devoid of meaning, and actually even less begs action. Even less provides a purpose. And yet, our lives now, which are limited, we worry about our limited life, whether it's worth doing anything. But I would reply and say that a life of unlimited days would be an even less reason to do anything. What a strange situation, though. And so some people argue that because our existence is limited, it means that we ought to do things to provide some happiness and have a good time while we're here. Versus someone who has an infinite number of days, laziness is inevitable. There really isn't a need to get up because you can always do it tomorrow. But in a limited existence, there won't always be a tomorrow. And so getting things done and accomplishing things and doing things that you want is important, because at some point you won't be able to do that, especially when you're older and have much limited capacities to accomplish things. Less will to power, as Nietzsche might say. But anyways, the fundamental point is that Postman is saying is that the fact of our temporary existence is not a narrative to live by. It is a very nihilistic and pessimistic view. We can find meaning in other things, and as I've also mentioned, we can find meaning in using our limited days to do things that we want to do. On page 113, he discusses is not our search for a narrative coming back when we see all kinds of nationalism going on, which he thinks is, he doesn't mention nationalism, but I think this is what he's talking about. He does mention tribalism, and he says here that, if nothing else, the almost worldwide return to tribalism signifies a search to recover a source of transcendent identity and values. So I thought that was interesting. That's I mentioned it.